I'm going to start by asking you to think about the challenge in your work. Right? And Brendan's talked a lot about the challenges, but so did the minister who started the morning today. And I think the minister frames it in a way that we're all very familiar with. Right? That is that the challenge of our work is achievement. It's outcomes. It's about preparing young people for the workforce. And as the minister made clear, we have work to do. We're not there yet, because not all children are achieving where we'd like, not all kids are ready for the workforce. And for that reason, he and others like him have a prescription of what needs to be done. Right? And it's part of a global strategy, because what's happening in Australia looks a lot like what's happening in the United States and many other countries. Some call it the global education reform movement. Okay. It's a lot about standards and accountability through assessment. Now, I want you to think back to what I said when I spoke at the opening keynote about the purpose of education. I said one purpose is for status attainment. It is for workforce readiness, university readiness, making sure kids have the knowledge and skills they'll need so they can function in the world. That is important. That is, I think, a central part of what we do. But it can never be all of what we do. So now I want you to think about Bob Brown, who left a big impression on me yesterday, because he reminded us of the huge challenges facing the world today. And I think part of the reason why the organizers of the conference had the good judgment to invite him was because of what I pointed out as the second purpose of education. The second purpose of education is to prepare young people to address the challenges facing the world and to use their intellect, to use their creativity, their critical mindset to address those problems and not be afraid. It's easy to feel afraid because of the uncertainty that Brendan talked about, because of the nature of the problems and the enormity of those problems. And at times when Bob was speaking, the enormity of the problems became, I think, a bit overwhelming for all of us. I would say that in many ways, what unites those problems, whether we're talking about the problem of inequality in the world, the problem of global warming and environmental sustainability, is what I would call a crisis of connection. That is, it is our inability as human beings to act in human interest. Across our differences, whether those differences be national or racial or linguistic or cultural or political and ideological. As Bob said, we are a human species that doesn't act like one. And I would say that crisis of connection results not only in us working against our interests, but in us pretending as though if we simply focus on ourselves, we can at least make our lives better. Which is a very small way of thinking about it. Right? It's as if we just hope, well, I just hope that global warming doesn't happen until after I die. I just hope that these diseases in the world just don't get me. Or these refugees don't land in my doorstep. We know the problems are out there, but we have this hope, this faint hope that maybe they won't affect us. And if you live in a wealthy, privileged nation, that's true to a large degree, although becoming less so. The individual who I think is speaking most clearly now in the world today about this crisis of connection is Pope Francis. So clearly that it's almost made me want to be a Catholic again. Because he's not only speaking about these enormous challenges facing the world, he's also acting on them. You know, he actually put a homeless shelter in right next to the Vatican. One of his first acts was to go into a prison and wash the feet of juvenile offenders. Because he's trying to show us that it's not good enough to speak about it, you actually have to do something about it. So again, I want to say that this crisis of connection prevents us from addressing our most pressing social, economic, and political problems. And as educators who are on the front lines of preparing the next generation for leadership, if we don't create a space for young people to think about it, then we are, I believe, neglecting our responsibility. I also don't believe that it has to come at the expense of thinking about whether or not they know their math and science and whether or not they can write. I don't think it's a choice. I think we can do both. And I see examples of people doing both, but I would say that to do both requires a major shift in the way we do our work. And I heard Brendan and several of the other speakers talk about that shift. When we see the refugee crisis, I want to really applaud the organizers for even last night reminding us that we can do something, even if it's as simple as just giving money. I was thinking about the fact that at U.S. education conferences, there would have been so much frustration and even resentment at the large number of speakers who did not talk about education at this conference. We're talking about everything else. They had us singing on stage, they had us doing all kinds of things, but they weren't talking about curriculum, they weren't talking about how to improve your schools. I would say in the United States, we have a very narrow vision on education. And that narrow vision results to a large degree in the reproduction of the very problems that we're constantly producing. I would say the crisis facing the refugees caused by war, I would say that the global warming that's threatening our planet has to be part of our curriculum. Has to be something that we educate our children about, has to be something that we think about, because these problems are not going to go away. They're getting more severe by the moment. And I would say that an educated person has to be able to look at, for example, a crisis like we've had in Ferguson, Missouri, but repeated in many cities across the country, of police violence largely against black people, as not a black problem, but a human problem. Because until we can make that kind of shift, the problems only get worse because it's somebody else's problem. Global warming is a problem if you live in the Maldives. But is it a problem if you live in Sydney? No, maybe. Sydney is on the coast, right? But maybe we can put it off, and maybe we can pretend it's not going to hit us yet. Rape has become an issue that we become more and more aware about now because of the large numbers of cases of date rapes on colleges and universities in the United States. Is that a woman's problem? Or is that a man's problem too? How we define the problem is going to affect how we act on the problem, or if we act on the problem. Now, I gave you the example at the very beginning of my talk of Ebola. And I gave that example for a reason, because it's one of the few examples I can think of where we did not allow, and when I say we, I'm being very generous with the we, because it was very specific people who did the work, not general people. It was those health workers. We did not allow our fear to paralyze us. It's very easy to imagine how that could have gone differently, isn't it? Because as the fear increased, we saw governments saying, we're going to quarantine, we're going to limit movement and travel, we're going to isolate the people who seem to pose the threat. And even as they were making the moves to do that, the disease was spreading. It was taking off, and it was showing up all around the world. And then there were others, like Dr. Masoka Fala, who said the way we're going to stop it is through trust. That's how we're going to stop it, is we're going to build trust. And we're going to go right to the epicenter of the crisis and take what we know and apply it. And so here he is, back in the community where he grew up. But look at him. He is a highly trained scientist at MIT, living in the comfort of Western civilization. He could have said, that's not my problem anymore. That's their problem. because he's a beneficiary of the brain drain. But instead he said, no, I have a responsibility to go back. So he goes back to West Point and he starts to organize and explain, this is how we're going to deal with the sick. He starts to work with the people with very, very few resources to create a public health system. Because that's what they did. And it wasn't as though they got a lot of aid, although aid did eventually come. Late, mostly. They used human resources to build that system. But most of all, they confronted the fears. There was a very troubling, disturbing image of a child, diseased child lying on the ground, and people looking at the child and afraid to help the child because they were afraid to contract the illness. People like Dr. Fowler said, no, there's a way to help the sick. And there's a way to handle the dead so that this disease doesn't spread. That kind of application of knowledge is the kind of application that overcomes the crisis of connection, that allows us to begin to confront very serious problems and to find tangible ways in which to solve them. Here's another example. This was the white jailer of Nelson Mandela, who, as a young man, befriended Nelson Mandela, largely because of Mandela. Because the role he was in as guard made him believe that the ANC were dangerous terrorists. Mandela was held 7 years in solitary confinement. But he saw not simply an oppressor in the person of a guard, but a young man who he could connect with. And they formed the connection because Mandela provided legal services to that man's families. That's how they formed the bond. Family was losing their home. Mandela was a lawyer, and he helped him figure out how to fight the foreclosure. And because of Mandela's help, the guard became an ally, risking his life, risking his job to send messages in to help the ANC while they were in a maximum security prison. You know what they said about Robben Island, that maximum security prison? The place that was designed to break and destroy the ANC? They said it became the ANC's university. It became a place where the next generation of leadership was trained, was prepared, right under the noses of the guards. Wow. If you could turn a maximum security prison into a university, what can you do with a school? How did they do it? They refused to accept their imprisonment, not from a physical standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint. They knew that they were very much under control. They knew that they were under constant surveillance, but they also knew that even under those adverse, oppressive conditions, there were possibilities for change. That's the thing to keep in mind. Even when you're working in schools with inadequate budgets and under policies that make no sense, and with a staff that maybe is not with you, or as someone pointed out to me, heavily unionized, and not necessarily willing to do anything extra that's not in their contract, the possibilities for doing significant, transformative work are still there. The question to you is, do you have the imagination and the vision to make that happen? I gave you the example the other day of Sadie Silva. Now, someone pointed out to me afterwards, they said, you know, I Googled her, and she's up on charges. She is. She was accused of taking contraband into a prison. And so she lost her job. It doesn't mean that she didn't do amazing things at her school. You can do both, can't you? How was it that she could create a school serving some of the poorest children in New York City, 30% of the children homeless, large numbers of children with learning disabilities, create a school that's succeeding in educating them? It wasn't about gimmicks. It wasn't about the latest technology. It was largely about building community, building partnership with parents. I met a principal yesterday. Where's Ian, who I met, who told me about his school? Oh, there's two Ians. Who told me that he has 132 parents a day at his school. 132 parents a day working with him in partnership. He said our parents are our resource, because not only are they helping where the teachers can't help, but they are reinforcing the education at home. Costs nothing to do that, does it? I told you about this school, Brockton High School. Largest high school in the state of Massachusetts, over 4,100 students. I don't know if you have schools that large in Australia. They decided when they were faced with the high-stakes exam and they knew 70% of their children would not pass the exam, a group of veteran teachers came up with the radical idea that what they needed to do was to focus on literacy. And not just in their language arts classes, but in science, in math, in phys ed. And when they went to their principal and said, this is what we've got to do, she said, great idea, but I can't make them do it. And I can't pay you to do it. You know what they said? They said, we'll work with the willing. We'll work on our own time. It's the only thing that makes sense. And it didn't happen in a year. It happened over 10 years, and it's still happening. Because progress breeds more progress. And by working with the willing, they won over those who were sitting on the sidelines saying, that's not my job. Because they say, oh wow, literacy actually works. And so here you have a school. If you Google Brockton High School, you know what you'll see? They had a riot at their graduation last year. Because the problems in their community didn't go away. It's still in a depressed city with high unemployment, high poverty. You know what it's known for? Boxing. That's the home of Rocky Marciano and Marvin Hagler. But it's also home to one of the best high schools in Massachusetts, which is the highest performing state in the United States. They didn't wait for the government to give them permission. They didn't say, you know, we need to do what the policies call for. They said, we need to do what the children need. And we need to organize ourselves to make it happen. They didn't ask for permission. Here's another school in the South Bronx, a school that serves a large number of undocumented children, which in the United States means their parents live as fugitives. They could be deported at any moment. Because they're undocumented, they cannot go to university because they don't meet the criteria. They're allowed to go to public school, but not the universities. And many of those children came to this country not literate in their native language because they weren't attending school regularly in their home countries. In most schools, these children will be more likely to fail than any other group. This school, over 95% of them graduate with command of several subjects. I visited the school. I've been working with the school now for several years. I said, what's the secret to the school? You know what it is? Collaboration. Teachers told me no lesson is delivered to a student unless teachers plan it together and vet it together. They said this work is too complex to leave it to an individual teacher doing it on their own. We've got to do it together. When I asked the students, what makes the school special? What makes it work for you? You know what they said? They said it feels like a family. I feel supported. I feel cared for, not just by the adults, but by my peers. This is a school where it's cool to be smart? Ask yourself now, is my school a place where it's cool to be smart? Where the values and the culture, the children are aligned with what we're trying to do? How do you do that in the South Bronx? A place where there's still gangs and violence and all kinds of huge social, economic problems. How do you create a school that works? Well, one of the themes that's come through this conference, although I don't think been named sufficiently, is that of agency. And as I was listening to Brendan, I kept thinking that what Brendan is really talking about is leaders who are agents. Leaders who are not working on compliance. They are very well aware of the constraints. And some of the constraints that you face are in the structure of your society. They're related to poverty. They're related to bad policy and bad politics. They're related to families in crisis. Some of them are cultural, related to a history of prejudice and racism, related to a belief that certain people are not smart enough, not capable enough, beliefs that still pervade our society. Agency is about understanding how to work within the constraints. Finding the possibilities for action, finding the possibilities for change, finding ways to create spaces where transformation is possible. That's where transformational leadership becomes so important. That's where the vision becomes so important, because if the people that you lead don't have a sense of what's possible, they'll be overwhelmed by the challenges. They'll be paralyzed by them. And that's why what we really have to do, what the work really is, it's not simply about training your teachers, it's not simply about inspiring them, though it's clearly about that, or engaging with parents. It's about a whole shift in the paradigm. A whole shift in the paradigm of education. If you read Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it's about paradigms. And Kuhn talks about the fact that paradigms don't just change very easily, because when there's a paradigm in place, there's a whole set of vested interest in maintaining that paradigm. And what allows a paradigm to shift is usually the old paradigm outlives its usefulness. It becomes obsolete. It ceases to be able to help us to solve problems, and therefore we begin to search for an alternative. I think we're at that point in education, because it's very clear that the old paradigm we've been under is producing more and more of the same problems that we've known. How can we create schools that actually make kids hate learning? How come so many of the children we talk to today, their main complaint about school is that it's what? That it's boring. Wow, something is fundamentally wrong. That old paradigm that most of us were educated in led us to believe that intelligence was innate. It's in your genes. Some people have it, some people don't. Some people are smart, some people are not. The job of school is to measure and sort. Make sure those we think are brightest get the best, because they have the most potential. And those we think are dull and dumb get something else. We practice triage in school, don't we? It's a lot about compliance and control under the old paradigm. Controlling the children, controlling your teachers, controlling your school, because you know that as a principal, as long as you do that, even if they're not learning, you'll probably keep your job. You run a tight ship. And if you're in compliance, it's about inequity in resources, giving the most to the children who have the most, and the least to the children who need the most. Why? Because we don't think they have the potential anyway. And it's about using discipline to punish children and to weed out the bad ones. In the US, we have a term called the school to prison pipeline. Because you can literally see that the children that we fail to educate are the ones we're most likely to incarcerate. And we incarcerate more people than any nation in the world, any time in history. That's where that old paradigm has taken us. I think it's long outlived its usefulness. The new paradigm, which requires not simply a shift in tactics or methods, it requires a shift in beliefs and epistemology. Because you can't shift a paradigm unless you actually shift your thinking. It forces us to recognize that intelligence and ability are influenced by opportunity, by stimulation, by contact, by exposure. We don't know about innate potential. We know that this, I'm not going to say genes don't matter, but I will say we have lots of examples of people with autism, of people with dyslexia, of people with any number of challenges who've been able to shine and do great things when given the right opportunities, the right support. Which is why we have to totally move away from this idea that some are gifted and some are not, because the gifts are always there. The question is, are we cultivating those gifts and those talents? And that's the shift, to cultivate the talents, to build community. Because through collaboration, through our work together, the work gets easier. That's how we become a school that's greater than the sum of its parts. It requires us to allocate resources based on needs rather than based on privilege. And it forces us to think about discipline as about character building, as a way of instilling a sense of ethics and broader moral responsibility to community. Now, it's more than that. I don't want to pretend this is by any means an exhaustive list, but what I want to encourage you to think about is whether or not you're able and willing to do this paradigm shift in your schools. I believe that the heart of leadership, which is the theme of your conference, is about being a transformational leader. But I believe to do that work, you have to have a clear vision of what the work is. What's required of educators now at this time in the world, given the crisis that we face. I believe it can be done because there are pockets and examples around the country and around the world where it's happening. I believe the challenge to you is how to make it happen where you live, where you work. How to create that environment where genuine change is possible. The future of your country, the future of the world, will be determined by what happens in its schools. It's that important. That's the reason why I think education is so important. I appreciate the fact that each of you have stepped up and continue to do this work. Now my challenge to you is, are you ready to do the work in a transformational way? I hope so. Thank you.